He had a vision no one believed in, building into an obsidian wall, a stone that seemed nothing but cold, lifeless rock. But when winter came, his creation held 71 degrees more heat, turning his laughing neighbors into humble admirers. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter wind howled as John Fisher stood at the edge of the small clearing, his eyes locked on the jagged obsidian wall that stretched across the valley like an ancient sentinel. The settlers had all built their homes with the same methods their fathers had used: log cabins, stone chimneys, hearths full of warmth. But John, with his quiet intensity, saw something no one else did. He was no stranger to the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival was not just a matter of grit, but of innovation. But this time, his innovation was going to test everything the other settlers believed. The obsidian wall had stood there for years, its dark surface gleaming with a promise of something more. Yet, the others saw it only as a cold, lifeless rock, unyielding and harsh, like the mountains themselves. And when John began chiseling away at the base, starting to carve out space for his cabin, they laughed. "You can't build in that, Thomas," a burly man with a laugh that shook the earth had said. "You'll freeze to death trying." But John ignored him. He wasn't just building a home, he was building a future. For days, he worked alone, digging into the obsidian as the snow piled up around him. The settlers had their doubts, and rightfully so. After all, who would think to build into a solid wall of stone when timber was readily available? Yet, as he stood there in the freezing wind, hammer in hand, John felt a strange warmth emanating from the stone, as if it was waiting for him to unlock its secrets. His mind raced with possibilities. The obsidian, he knew, had an inherent strength, a solid, almost mystical quality to it. And if he could tap into that, if he could somehow harness the heat the mountain absorbed during the sun-drenched summer months, he could create a home that would not only stand firm against the wild elements, but also keep the inside warmer than anything a log cabin could offer. The other settlers didn't see it yet. They saw only folly. But John wasn't concerned with their opinions. The truth was buried deep in the earth, and he was determined to dig it out. John spent the first week chiseling away at the stone, shaping it, feeling its cold surface give way under his tool. The settlers came and went, offering little more than a mix of mocking laughter and half-hearted warnings. They didn't understand, and they probably never would. What drove him, though, was more than just an idea. It was a vision that kept him awake at night, staring into the darkness, hearing the wind whip through the trees, and knowing, deep down, that there was a better way. It wasn't just the stone he was working with, it was the land itself. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know that the earth had a memory. Every winter, the cold would seep into his bones, even with a crackling fire at his back. But the stone, the obsidian, had been there for millennia, untouched by the hands of man. It had withstood the harshest winters and the brightest summers, holding secrets in its layers that could change everything for the people who dared to use it. The first real challenge came when he needed to make the stone habitable. The settlers built their homes quickly, slapping logs together with rough hands and little thought to the long term. But John was building for the future. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't mind the back-breaking work, the isolation. What mattered to him was the end result. As the first frost set in, John felt a deep sense of determination. His hands were raw from weeks of chipping away at the stone, but there was a warmth he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the heat from the fire, nor was it the heavy furs he wore to protect himself from the cold. It was the stone itself, radiating a kind of latent heat that made his chest feel full, his heart steady. Yet the others didn't see it. They called it madness. They said he'd never finish. Even his closest friend, Peter, tried to talk him out of it. "John," Peter had said, "it's too late in the season. You're not going to get that thing finished before the worst of winter sets in. Come back to the cabin. Let's head back to the settlement before the snow makes it impossible to leave." But John wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when he was so close. The stone had a life of its own. When he touched it, there was a pulse beneath his fingertips, a vibration that felt like the earth itself was speaking to him. He knew the potential was there. It wasn't just a material to be cut, shaped, and worked with. It was a living thing, something that could shelter him in ways the others couldn't understand. Night after night, John toiled, carving deeper into the obsidian, shaping his future, one chisel stroke at a time. The first storm of winter arrived like a freight train, blasting through the valley with an intensity that made the trees bend low to the ground. The wind howled, and the snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, burying everything in its path. John's work, still not fully finished, seemed to stand little chance against the fury of nature. His cabin, little more than a shell, was open to the elements on three sides, and the stone walls, despite their promise, still hadn't proven their worth. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, sending small puffs of smoke into the ceiling, but it was hardly enough to chase away the bite of the wind that seeped through every crack. The single, tiny window that John had installed allowed for just a sliver of light, and it seemed to get dimmer with each passing hour as the storm raged outside. John sat with his back to the wall, wrapped tightly in his furs, staring into the fire, his mind spinning with doubt. He had done everything he could to make this work. He had studied the stone, felt the warmth beneath his hands, and had built with patience and care. But now, facing the harshest conditions of the year, it felt as though the stone itself had betrayed him. The storm continued through the night, growing colder with every gust of wind. John shivered, despite the layers of clothing he had wrapped around himself, his bones aching from the unrelenting cold. The fire was almost out. He had no more wood left to feed it, and outside, the snow had buried everything. He could hear the howling of wolves in the distance, the only sound that seemed to rival the wind itself. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The cold gnawed at him, slipping beneath his skin, reminding him that he wasn't immune to nature's power. In the early hours of the morning, the storm still hadn't let up, and the cabin felt colder than it ever had before. John's breath formed visible clouds in the dim light. He had never experienced such intense cold, even on the harshest nights of his years in the mountains. His thoughts drifted back to the days when he had first begun this project, when he had believed the obsidian wall would hold the warmth it had promised, a heat that would keep him safe. But now, as frost began to form along the edges of the stone and ice gathered in the corners of the cabin, John realized how foolish he had been to think that the stone could stand up to the elements alone. Despite the bone-chilling cold, John refused to give in to despair. He had been through worse, much worse, and he wasn't about to let this storm break him. He had survived brutal winters in the past, fought for every scrap of warmth and food. This was no different. But still, the nagging question lingered in his mind. Had he miscalculated? Had he been too eager to prove something to the settlers, too driven by his own sense of pride? The thought of failure gnawed at him, threatening to undo everything he had worked for. As the storm continued to rage outside, John pulled his furs tighter around him and closed his eyes. He would survive this. He had no choice but to. But deep in his gut, a small part of him wondered if he had misjudged the stone's promise, if the wall that had seemed so full of potential was in fact just another cold mountain, indifferent to his efforts. The following days brought little relief. The storm finally passed, but the chill in the air lingered, its icy fingers reaching deep into John's cabin. He knew that he had to finish his work soon or risk being trapped in an unfinished shelter for the remainder of the winter. He spent his days gathering wood and working with the stone, but the cold kept him from doing much more than the bare essentials. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the wind picked up once again, John couldn't help but feel the sting of doubt creeping into his thoughts. It wasn't just the weather that troubled him, it was the silence of the settlers, the way they now avoided him, no longer laughing at his efforts but watching from a distance, unsure of what to make of him. Their skepticism was starting to weigh heavily on his shoulders, and the quiet conversations he overheard as he passed through the settlement only added to the pressure. They spoke in hushed tones, wondering aloud if John had gone mad, if he was risking his life for a folly that could cost him everything. Even Peter, his closest friend, had grown distant. It was subtle at first, the way Peter would look at him with something like pity in his eyes when he visited. Then, one afternoon, Peter had stopped by the cabin while John was working on the stone. His face was grave as he stood in the doorway, looking at the incomplete structure. "John," Peter had said, his voice hesitant, "you've put everything into this. You've risked your life. But you've got to ask yourself, is it worth it?" The question had stung more than John cared to admit. Peter had been with him during the darkest times in the mountains, and to hear him question his work was like a blow to the chest. But Peter was right, in a way. John had put everything into this cabin. He had staked his future on the Obsidian wall, believing it could keep him safe, believing it would be the answer to all the struggles that had defined his life in the wilderness. That night, as he sat by the fire, John tried to push the doubts away. He told himself that the storm had been a test, that the Obsidian wall was still strong, that it would hold the heat once it was properly sealed and finished. But deep down, a voice whispered that he might have been wrong, that the stone might not be enough to withstand the relentless cold of the mountains. He had spent so much time working alone, trusting only his instincts and his hands, that the thought of asking for help, or worse, admitting failure, felt unbearable. The wall had promised something: great warmth, safety, and stability, but now that promise felt fragile, as though it could shatter with the next gust of wind. The warmth he had once felt from the stone now seemed distant. It was a faint memory, like a dream he could no longer reach. As the wind howled once again outside the cabin, John buried his face in his hands, struggling to understand what was slipping away from him. The wind continued to lash against the obsidian wall, howling like a pack of wolves circling the cabin. John Fisher stood in the doorway, the harsh winds biting at his exposed face. But his mind was focused not on the cold, but on the quiet that had settled over the settlement. It had been days since the storm had passed, but the valley still felt as though it held its breath, waiting for something or someone to break the silence. John had worked tirelessly through the week, chiseling the stone and piecing together the parts of his cabin. But the heat he had once hoped for from the wall still eluded him. The stone, though beautiful and solid, had yet to hold the warmth he needed to feel truly safe. And the worst part of it all was the creeping uncertainty. The doubts that had been whispering in his mind since the storm had grown louder, and the skepticism from the settlers had grown more palpable. One afternoon, as he sat against the unfinished wall, exhausted from his day's work, he heard footsteps outside. His heart tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He was no longer the subject of mockery. Now he was the object of quiet curiosity. The others had started to watch him again, but now their eyes were different. They weren't laughing at him, not like before. Now they simply watched with something else, something that felt like judgment. The footsteps drew nearer, and John stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands were still sore from the constant chipping, and his back ached from days of hunched labor. But he wasn't about to stop. The moment he had been waiting for was coming, the moment when he would prove to himself and to them that his work was not a mistake. Peter appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face drawn and weathered from the cold. He had a solemn look about him, one that John didn't quite recognize. As Peter approached, his footsteps muffled by the snow, John's heart pounded. This wasn't a visit for a friendly chat. This was something more. "John," Peter began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking about what you're doing here, and I need to tell you something." John met his gaze, steadying himself. He was ready for another round of gentle persuasion to give it up, to join the others in their more traditional, safer homes. He could already hear the words, "You've tried, John, but it's not going to work. Come back to the settlement. There's nothing wrong with a log cabin." But Peter's words weren't what John expected. Instead, Peter's eyes softened as he continued, "I can see what you're trying to do, and I won't pretend to understand it fully. But I do know this. You've put your heart into this. And I think you're right. This stone, it's got something we don't understand, but I see you've got it figured out more than anyone else." John's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to say. There was something about Peter's support, his quiet acceptance, that stirred something deep within John, something he hadn't realized he was craving. He had fought so long for validation, to prove that this obsession was worth it, that it wasn't a mere folly. Peter's quiet faith in him was all John needed to hear. "I don't know how, but I'm going to finish this," John said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have to. If I don't, then it'll all be for nothing." Peter nodded, his expression serious. "Then I'll help. It might not be much, but I'll lend a hand. You're not alone in this, John." The weight on John's shoulders lifted just a little. With Peter's support, however small it seemed, he felt a glimmer of hope spark in his chest. Perhaps this stone, this wall that everyone had called foolish, held more than just the promise of heat. Maybe it held the possibility of something deeper: connection, understanding, and perhaps even acceptance. As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, John Fisher could feel the season turning, a silent reminder that winter was far from over. The frost crept into the valley once more, coating the world in a layer of ice, turning the landscape into a frozen sculpture of sharp angles and brittle beauty. But as cold as the air grew, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing within his cabin, something subtle, something that gave him hope. The stone, for the first time since the storm, seemed to be holding warmth. It wasn't much, but as he stood close to the obsidian wall, he could feel the faintest radiance emanating from it. The heat was there just enough to chase away the chill in the air. It was the warmth that he had been waiting for, the warmth he had believed in all along. But it wasn't a simple heat, like a fire in the hearth. No, this was something different. It was like the stone had absorbed the sun's rays and held them captive, offering a slow, steady release of warmth that kept the cabin just a little more bearable in the harshest cold. John worked steadily, now with Peter by his side, as they reinforced the cabin's structure. The walls were finally taking shape, and the windows, though small, allowed the light to filter through and bathe the interior in a soft, golden glow. The work wasn't easy, the stone was stubborn, and John's hands ached more than ever. But with each day, the warmth in the cabin grew stronger, and the cold outside seemed to lose its grip on his spirit. One evening, after a long day of work, John sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the hearth. His mind wandered back to the first moments when he had decided to build into the obsidian wall. He had believed it would hold heat, but he had never been certain. Now, as the warmth filled the cabin, he knew he had made the right choice. The stone was more than just a material to build with. It was alive, in a way, holding a kind of warmth that no other material could. Peter sat beside him, staring into the fire. "You were right, John," he said quietly. "This stone, it's something special." John nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had been right. It wasn't just the stone he had believed in, but his ability to make something new out of the world around him. And now, as the frost settled on the ground outside, he knew the battle wasn't just with the weather, it was with his own doubts. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The cold couldn't break him. The stone was holding its promise. The first frost had come, but inside John's cabin it was warm, in a way that couldn't be explained by the fire alone. The stone had kept its word. As winter settled deeper into the valley, John Fisher's cabin began to take shape. The obsidian walls, though still imperfect, had started to display their true potential. He had spent months chiseling and carving, shaping the stone, and watching as the cabin slowly transformed from a half-finished shell to a solid structure. Each day was a battle, not just against the weather, but against his own growing doubts. But the heat in the walls, though subtle, was undeniable. It had begun to spread, filling the cabin with a steady warmth that defied the fierce cold outside. Still, it wasn't enough. There was so much left to be done. The roof, still incomplete, left the cabin vulnerable. The window shutters were hastily crafted, and the door, though sturdy, lacked the refinement John had envisioned. Time was running out. The worst of winter was still to come, and John knew that the unfinished structure was a gamble. Every piece of the cabin felt like a fragile thread, holding together a dream that seemed too big for one man to carry alone. The pressure was building, and John could feel it pressing against him, a weight that refused to be ignored. The frost outside was thickening, the snow piling up deeper with each passing day. The ground beneath his feet was frozen solid, and every trip to the nearby woods for firewood seemed like an expedition to the ends of the earth. The isolation was suffocating, and John's muscles ached with the strain of constant labor. But through it all, the one thing that kept him going was the quiet warmth radiating from the stone wall. Despite everything, the cabin had shown him that it could stand against the elements, that it could withstand the worst of winter if only he could finish it in time. The sun dipped lower each day, the nights growing longer. As the cold deepened, John pushed harder. He worked into the evenings, long after the shadows had fallen, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the hearth and the dim glow of the stone walls. His hands were raw, his back stiff, but the sight of the cabin taking form gave him the strength to keep going. He could see the end in sight, and that kept him moving. The settlers, once skeptical, had started to take notice. They no longer mocked him or turned their backs when he passed. Instead, they watched from a distance, their curiosity piqued by the stubborn man who refused to give up on his impossible idea. Some of them even came to offer a hand, bringing food or supplies, but John, ever the solitary worker, accepted only what he needed, refusing to let others see just how fragile his spirit had become. This was his project, and only he could finish it. One evening, as John worked late into the night, Peter stopped by. His face was pale from the cold, but his eyes were steady. "John," he said, his voice low, "I know you've been pushing yourself harder than anyone else, but you've got to rest. The cabin will still be there tomorrow. You don't need to finish it all tonight." John looked at him, his tired eyes meeting Peter's. The weight of his friend's concern felt like a moment of relief, but the pressure was still there. "I can't stop now," John muttered. "Not until it's done. Not until I know it works. I have to prove to myself, to everyone, that this was worth it." Peter didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and left. But as he stepped into the night, John couldn't help but feel the heavy truth of those words. The cabin was more than just a shelter. It had become a symbol of something deeper, a fight against doubt, against fear, and against the belief that the frontier could break him. The wind howled outside, but John didn't stop working. With every log he placed, every stone he shaped, he was one step closer to finishing what he had started. And for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. The cabin, his obsidian sanctuary, would be ready. It had to be. By the time the first heavy snowstorm of January hit, John Fisher's cabin was nearly finished. The obsidian walls stood tall and solid, the roof was almost complete, and the shutters on the windows, though rudimentary, were functioning. The fire in the hearth crackled louder than before, its heat intensifying as the stone walls absorbed and reflected the warmth. It was as if the cabin had become a living, breathing organism, holding the winter at bay with every breath it took. But despite the warmth inside, the valley outside had turned into a frozen wilderness. The storm that had arrived so suddenly had trapped John in his cabin, a prisoner of the very weather he had sought to escape. The wind howled across the valley, pushing snow and ice against the cabin walls. John knew that if he didn't finish the last few details, particularly the securing of the roof, he would be vulnerable. The storm was unlike any he had seen before, its ferocity unrelenting and fierce. But even then, John felt a strange sense of comfort in the walls around him. The obsidian stone, cold as it was, held the heat of the fire inside as no log cabin could. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. The wind screamed, carrying with it the biting chill that had plagued the valley for weeks. John stood by the fire, staring at the walls of his creation. The stone had held its promise, But he still had work to do. There was still no guarantee that the cabin would withstand the storm in its entirety. It had held the heat, but could it hold against the full force of winter? Suddenly, there was a noise outside, sharp and unsettling, the unmistakable sound of something or someone pushing against the walls. John's heart skipped a beat. He knew what it was before he even stepped to the window. It was a bear. The massive animal had been prowling the area for weeks, sniffing around the cabins and testing their defenses. John had heard stories of bears breaking through wooden doors and tearing apart walls to get to the food inside. He had built his cabin to withstand the worst, but now, in the middle of the night, in the heart of the fiercest storm he had ever encountered, the bear had come for his shelter. John grabbed his rifle, his breath steady despite the rush of adrenaline in his veins. The wind outside howled, but inside there was only the sound of his own heart beating. He peered through the narrow gun ports he had built into the walls. The bear, massive and unyielding, circled the cabin, testing its strength, clawing at the stone. John's mind raced. The obsidian wall had held heat, but would it hold against a bear's sheer strength? He didn't know. But what he did know was that the bear wasn't going to stop until it got inside. With a deep breath, John steadied his rifle. The storm might rage outside, but inside he was ready. The cabin had survived the cold, the isolation, the endless labor. Now, it would have to survive the one test it had yet to face. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury blanketing the valley in snow, but inside John Fisher's cabin, the heat held steady. The obsidian walls, which had once seemed so uncertain, now radiated warmth, their ability to absorb the sun's heat and store it becoming more apparent with every passing hour. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the stone walls, despite their cold appearance, now felt like a dependable ally in the fight against the brutal winter. Yet, even as John stood in the center of his cabin, tending to the fire and preparing his evening meal, he couldn't ignore the whispers that had started to circle the valley. His work had drawn attention, not just from the settlers around him, but from those further afield. In the first few days after he had completed his cabin, they had ridiculed him, calling his efforts a folly. But now, there was something different in the air. The settlers who had once laughed at him now spoke of his cabin with a hushed reverence, a tone that made John uneasy. The first to come by after the storm was Thomas, a grizzled trapper who had always found a way to mock John's unconventional methods. Thomas had arrived on foot, his face red from the cold, and though he still wore his usual skeptical expression, there was something else in his eyes. John noticed that the older man didn't come to laugh, nor to criticize. Instead, he came to observe. "I've been hearing things," Thomas said as he stepped into the cabin, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "About your cabin. Some of the boys over at the settlement are talking. They say it's warmer than anything they've got." John kept his eyes on the fire, his hands working the logs, but he could feel the question hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what Thomas wanted, but he wasn't about to indulge in an argument about the legitimacy of his work. "I've been testing it," John replied. "It holds heat better than I expected. I knew the stone had potential." Thomas took a seat near the hearth, glancing around the room. He wasn't looking for confirmation from John. No, his eyes darted from the stone walls to the fire, from the window shutters to the sturdy door. The cabin, despite its unconventional construction, had an undeniable solidity to it, a quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. "Some of the boys are saying it's something to do with the obsidian," Thomas muttered, scratching at his beard. "They don't understand it. Can't quite figure out why your place is warmer than theirs, and they've all got their cabins built solid." John nodded, his heart sinking slightly at the recognition that the settlers were beginning to talk, and not in the way he had hoped. This wasn't admiration. This was curiosity laced with confusion, a dangerous cocktail when it came to frontier living. "People are talking," Thomas continued, his voice low. "Some of them want to come see it for themselves, want to know how you did it. But others, they think you've got something strange here, something they don't understand." John didn't respond immediately. He could hear the rumblings of a community uncertain about his work, unsure whether to embrace it or dismiss it as nonsense. He had always known that people who didn't understand his vision would be skeptical, but hearing that it had reached the far corners of the valley made him uneasy. "They're all talking," Thomas said as he stood up, making his way to the door. "And not all of them are kind words. You've got to be careful, John. People around here don't like things they can't explain." As the door closed behind him and the wind picked up again outside, John sank into the nearest chair, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The cabin was warmer than any other home in the valley, but with that warmth came the kind of attention he hadn't been prepared for. The whispers were just beginning, and John realized that the life he had worked so hard to build might be about to change, not because of the storm outside, but because of the storm brewing within the community. The days passed slowly, but the tension in the valley was palpable. John could feel it in the air, a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. More and more settlers, intrigued by the rumors of the warmth in his cabin, began to visit. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine interest, but they all shared one thing in common: a desire to understand what John had done that had made his cabin so different from theirs. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountain, a visitor arrived. It was William Marshall, a trapper who had been working on the far side of the valley. William's reputation preceded him. He was a seasoned survivalist, a man who knew the land and its challenges like the back of his hand. And yet, when he stepped into John's cabin, it was clear that even he didn't fully understand what he was seeing. "I've heard the stories," William said, stepping inside, his eyes wide as they swept across the walls. "But I didn't believe them, not until I felt it myself." John nodded, not entirely surprised. He had expected someone like William to come, someone who had experience in the mountains and could appreciate the practical benefits of his work. William's hands rested on the stone wall, and for a moment there was silence. 71 degrees more heat," William muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "How did you do it, John?" John felt the question deep in his chest. How had he done it? He didn't have the answer in a simple form. He had worked tirelessly, pushing himself to the brink, driven by the belief that the stone could offer something more, something that traditional log cabins couldn't. But in truth, he hadn't fully understood why it worked either. It wasn't just the heat, it was the balance, the way the stone absorbed and released warmth in a way that no one had ever imagined. "I don't know," John replied, his voice steady. "I just trusted the land, the stone. It's been here longer than any of us." William looked at him, a long silence passing between them. The storm outside seemed to fade as the two men shared this moment of quiet understanding. William had spent his life in the wilderness, but even he had never seen anything like this. "Most men would have given up," William finally said, his voice heavy with respect. "They'd have let the cold break them, but not you. You kept going. And now," he trailed off, a thoughtful look crossing his face, "now, you've built something that's more than just a cabin. You've built something that changes the way we live out here." John didn't know what to say. He had never set out to change anything. He had simply wanted to survive, to find a way to live that wasn't dictated by the whim of the seasons. But now, as William stood there, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, John realized that his creation had done more than just protect him from the cold. It had sparked something in the people around him, a new way of thinking, a new way of surviving. John turned to the window, looking out at the snowy landscape, the storm still howling outside. He had made it through, not just by brute strength or willpower, but by believing in something that no one else could see. The obsidian wall had become more than just a shelter. It had become a beacon, a symbol of what could be accomplished when someone dared to believe that there was always another way. The days grew shorter as the heart of winter settled into the valley, bringing with it the oppressive cold that gnawed at the bones of anyone brave enough to venture outside. Yet inside John Fisher's cabin there was warmth that no one had expected. Word of his success had spread beyond the small settlement. trickling out like wildfire to the distant fur trappers and homesteaders who dotted the mountain range. Everyone had heard of the strange cabin built into the obsidian wall that could withstand the bitter cold of the Rockies. But now, something was happening. People weren't just curious, they were coming to see for themselves. One by one, settlers began to visit John. Drawn by the rumors and the strange warmth that emanated from the cabin, they came cautiously at first, eyes wide with skepticism, but their disbelief began to melt away as soon as they stepped inside. The fire in the hearth crackled, but it wasn't the fire that kept the cabin warm. It was the stone. John's obsidian walls had absorbed the heat from the sun during the day, and now, as the night descended, it released that heat in a steady, gentle flow, like a living thing. At first, the visitors came with questions. They asked John how he had built it, how the stone could possibly hold heat, and if they could replicate his work. They wanted to know if it was the stone, or the technique, or just sheer luck. John, as always, was reluctant to explain fully. He had never seen this as a magic trick or a miracle. It was simply a process, a long trial of testing, of learning, and, most importantly, of trusting his instincts. It wasn't science or sorcery. It was his own brand of ingenuity born out of necessity. One morning, after a particularly heavy snowfall, Thomas returned with his younger brother, Isaac, who had recently arrived in the valley. Isaac had heard the stories, but had dismissed them as exaggerations. That was, until he stepped inside John's cabin. Isaac's eyes grew wide as he looked around, the heat from the walls pressing against his skin. The fire burned brightly, but it was the warmth in the air, radiating from the obsidian walls, that left him speechless. "By God, it's true," Isaac said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "This place, this cabin, it's warmer than my whole house." John, sitting by the fire, nodded but didn't speak. He was used to this kind of reaction by now. He had built the cabin for himself, for his own survival, but seeing the amazement in their eyes filled him with a quiet satisfaction. The warmth in the cabin was more than just physical, it was symbolic of the change he had fought for. A shift in the way people viewed the land, the wilderness, and what could be done with the right knowledge and determination. Over the next few weeks, more and more settlers came, and each time they left, they took pieces of the story with them. They talked about the stone walls, about the warmth that seemed to come from nowhere, and about the man who had dared to build differently. It wasn't just the cabin that drew them in, but the idea that there was something more to the land than what they had been taught. But even as John basked in the attention, a quiet unease began to settle in his chest. He had built something extraordinary, but now the question of whether he could ever truly escape the skepticism of the valley lingered in the background. He had wanted validation, but now, as the attention spread, he wondered if it would be enough. As the days turned to weeks, and winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley, John spent more and more time inside his cabin, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He had built this cabin not just for shelter, but to prove something not to the world, but to himself. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, the obsidian wall had become his refuge, his sanctuary, and his symbol of perseverance. Yet, as the heat from the stone walls kept the cold at bay, John found that it wasn't just the physical warmth that had changed his life. It was the lessons the cabin had taught him, lessons about patience, about pushing through doubts, and about seeing the world not as a series of obstacles to be conquered, but as a place full of untapped potential waiting to be discovered. Sitting by the fire one night, his eyes tracing the cracks in the stone walls, John thought about the years he had spent in the wilderness, the struggles he had faced, and the doubts that had haunted him. He had once been like the other settlers, unsure of what he could accomplish, afraid to push beyond the limits set by others. But now, in the quiet of his cabin, he realized how far he had come. The obsidian wall, which had once seemed like nothing more than a barrier to his progress, had become the key to his survival. And in doing so, it had shown him that the only real limits were the ones he set for himself. The fire crackled softly as the wind howled outside, but John felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself to others, but now, for the first time, he realized that the only approval he needed was his own. The cabin was his, and he had built it with his own hands, trusting his instincts and his ability to adapt. He had created something that not only kept the cold out, but also taught him the true meaning of resilience. The warmth from the stone walls wrapped around him, a constant reminder that the world was full of possibilities, even in the most unexpected places. John didn't need the approval of the settlers anymore. He didn't need to prove himself. He had already done it. The cabin was his testament, the stone his constant companion, and the heat, both literal and figurative, was a symbol of the strength he had found within himself. As the night stretched on and the storm outside continued its relentless assault on the valley, John settled into his chair, his eyes closing in quiet contentment. He had built more than a cabin. He had built a new way of living, a new way of seeing the land and his place in it, and for the first time in years he felt truly at home. As the snow began to thaw and the first signs of spring emerged from beneath the white blanket that had covered the valley, John Fisher's cabin had become more than just a shelter. It had become a symbol of something larger than he had ever intended. The stone walls, once a point of mockery, had proven themselves worthy of admiration. The settlers, who had once ridiculed John for his unconventional approach, were now coming to him for advice. The word had spread far beyond the valley, reaching other fur trappers, homesteaders, and even a few more established settlers from nearby towns. They had heard stories about the warmth of John's cabin, about how it withstood the bitter cold of the Rockies and stood firm against the harshness of winter. Curiosity had turned to respect, and that respect had turned to quiet envy. At first, John hadn't known how to react to the attention. He had spent so many years isolated from the world, building his cabin in silence, relying only on his instincts and the land. But now he found himself surrounded by visitors, each one eager to see his work, to understand what he had done that had made his cabin different from all the others. The settlers who had once laughed at him now came with questions. They wanted to know how he had built the obsidian walls, how he had made them hold heat, and what materials he had used. Some of them were even taking notes, planning to replicate the techniques in their own homes. John had never intended to start a trend, but here it was, happening right before his eyes. And yet, despite the newfound admiration, there was something missing. The settlers, though respectful, still didn't fully understand. They still saw his work as something strange, as something that couldn't quite fit into their established world. They marveled at the heat in his cabin but had a hard time grasping the larger idea behind it. John had never built the cabin for recognition. He had built it to survive, to prove to himself that he could adapt, that he could make something work when everything else seemed to fail. But now, as he stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the settlers gather outside, John realized that the silence he had once craved had been replaced by something he hadn't expected. They weren't mocking him anymore. They weren't laughing at him. Instead, they were watching him with something like awe. But it wasn't just awe, it was respect, the kind that only came after a challenge had been met head-on and overcome. He knew that the whispers about his work would eventually die down. As the settlers moved on with their lives, as the harsh winter turned to spring, the novelty of his cabin would fade. But for now, John stood in the doorway, looking out over the valley that had once seemed so indifferent to his existence, and he felt a quiet sense of pride. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was a testament to his perseverance, to his willingness to fight against the odds. And that, John realized, was enough. The seasons changed, and as the winter's hold finally loosened its grip on the valley, John Fisher continued his work. The settlers who had once watched from the sidelines were now asking for his help, seeking to build their own homes like his, sturdy, warm, and resilient against the cold. The valley, once a place of isolation and doubt, had begun to shift. It had been transformed by one man's refusal to accept the limitations of conventional thinking. John, however, didn't see himself as a leader or a trailblazer. He had simply built what was necessary, what was right for him, And yet, as the demand for his knowledge grew, he realized that his actions had begun to shape something larger. The simple cabin he had built with his own hands was no longer just a structure. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone dared to do things differently. As the settlers came to him with their requests for advice, John's own sense of purpose began to crystallize. He had never intended to become a teacher, but in helping others, he realized that his work had the power to change lives. Each time he shared his techniques, each time he helped another settler build their cabin with the same care and attention to detail, John felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. He was leaving behind something that would endure long after the memory of his name had faded, a legacy not just of survival, but of ingenuity and resilience. Word spread further still, and soon, people from distant settlements were arriving, seeking John's wisdom. They didn't just want to know how to build their cabins like his, they wanted to know the secrets of the stone, the way it could hold heat and resist the biting cold. John shared everything he knew, but he was careful not to make it sound like something magical. The stone was no miracle. It was simply the right material, used in the right way, by someone who was willing to learn from the land. As the years passed, more homes in the valley were built using the techniques John had pioneered. The settlers who once doubted him had become some of his most loyal students, eager to pass on the knowledge he had shared. John didn't claim credit for their successes. He simply gave them the tools to build, to survive, and to live better. The obsidian wall that had once seemed like a symbol of his folly had become a lasting reminder of his determination. It wasn't just about surviving in the mountains anymore. It was about thriving, about adapting to the world and finding new ways to live in harmony with it. And though John never sought fame or recognition, he knew that his work would endure. His cabins, built with care and resilience, would stand as a testament to the power of innovation and the courage to challenge the status quo. The valley, the land, and the people who had once mocked him now stood as proof that even in the harshest conditions, there was always a way forward. As John Fisher looked out across the valley one final time, he saw the future he had helped build, a future where innovation and survival went hand in hand, and where the stone walls he had so carefully crafted would continue to protect generations to come. The new cabins, built using John's techniques, began to stand tall against the harsh winds of the valley. But not everyone was eager to adopt his methods. Some settlers, deeply entrenched in their ways, continued to build their homes the old-fashioned way, rejecting the stone and John's innovations. They saw his methods as unnecessary and too much trouble, too much effort for something they thought was no better than tradition. John watched them with a quiet resignation, understanding their reluctance. Change was never easy, especially when it came to something as fundamental as shelter. But as he watched the new homes take shape, built with care and resilience, he knew the valley was better for it. Even if some didn't understand, the seeds of change had been planted, and that was enough. But in his heart, John couldn't help but wonder if the old ways would ever truly disappear, or if there would always be those who clung to the past, too afraid to see the future. John stood by his cabin, the wind now a gentle breeze that carried the first whispers of spring. His work, his legacy, was taking root in the valley. He had shown them that survival wasn't just about endurance, but about learning, adapting, and building a future. He didn't seek recognition or thanks. The quiet respect from the settlers was enough. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, John felt a deep sense of peace. The valley had changed, and so had he. What began as a struggle for survival had transformed into a lesson for all. His journey was far from over, but for now, he was content knowing he had left something behind, something that would endure long after he was gone. As the years passed, the bustling curiosity around John Fisher's cabin began to fade into a quiet familiarity. The settlers who had once visited in awe, eager to see the obsidian walls for themselves, now merely glanced at John's cabin when they passed by. They had built their own homes using the same techniques he had pioneered, and the valley, once full of whispers and skepticism, had settled into a rhythm of acceptance. John had grown quieter with time, content with the work he had done. The storms of winter still swept through the valley, but inside his cabin, the heat from the stone walls was a constant companion. He had spent so many years building, creating, and proving something to the world, but now, as the years wore on, he found peace in the simplicity of his life. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise still cabin. Outside, the wind howled, but the obsidian walls held firm, sheltering John from the brutal cold. The warmth that the stone provided was more than physical now. It was a reminder of everything he had overcome. The isolation, the doubt, the relentless winters, they had all been part of a journey that had led him to this place of quiet satisfaction. John's hands had slowed, his back ached more than it once had, but the cabin was still standing strong. The land had given him the strength he needed to build something that would endure. He hadn't done it for recognition or to prove a point to anyone but himself. And now, in his old age, he realized that he had achieved something far more meaningful than he ever imagined. He had built not just a cabin, but a legacy. And as the snow piled up outside, John felt that quiet peace wash over him, the peace of knowing that the world he had helped shape was still standing strong, just like the walls of his cabin. By the time John Fisher's health began to fade, the valley had changed in ways he hadn't expected. His work, his cabins, had become a part of the landscape, a quiet legacy that people now relied on without thinking twice. The obsidian walls, once a strange and radical idea, had become the norm. John's methods were now the standard for anyone looking to build a sturdy, warm shelter that could withstand the harsh winters of the Rockies. John had never sought fame. He never expected his name to be whispered in reverence or his ideas to be passed down for generations. He had simply wanted to survive, to find a way to live that would keep him safe in the unforgiving wilderness. But as the years went by, he realized that his work had done more than just that. It had changed the way people thought about survival. It had shown them that strength wasn't just about physical might or traditional methods. It was about ingenuity, about adapting to the land and learning from it. The settlers who had once mocked him now spoke of him with respect. His name was no longer the punchline of a joke, but a symbol of resilience. And as the first settlers who had mocked him passed on, their children and grandchildren carried the lessons they had learned from John into their own lives. They built homes, just like his, sturdy and warm, relying on the same principles he had used to create his sanctuary. As John sat in his cabin one quiet afternoon, the fire crackling softly before him, he looked out over the valley. The winds were calm now, the worst of winter behind them. He could see the cabins in the distance, each one a silent testament to the legacy he had built. The valley had changed, but it had also stayed the same. The stone walls still stood, holding heat through the cold nights, just as they had always done. When John passed away, there was no grand ceremony. The valley simply carried on. His name wasn't etched in stone or written in books, but his legacy lived on in the homes that stood strong against the elements. The cabins, warm with the heat stored in their obsidian walls, were a reminder of the man who had dared to do something different and in doing so had changed the way the valley survived. John Fisher had built more than just a cabin. He had built a future. And in that quiet, enduring stone, his legacy would live on long after he was gone.